The ongoing review of the EU's Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, or CBAM, aims to reduce the burden on small EU enterprises without sacrificing the bloc's decarbonisation goals. As the shadow of trade war looms over the international market, what do the politics of the review signify for EU competitiveness and cohesion? You're listening to Energy Bites with ELS Analysis. Welcome to this week's episode.
Okay, welcome to Energy Bites with ELS. This is our 15th episode. I'm Carl Rosenberg, today's host, and with me today I have market analyst Sedat Ayer and our regulatory analyst Shana Casas. Welcome to you both.
Hello.
Hey, thank you.
Today's episode takes us to Brussels, where the European Commission has revised its CBAM bill. The new revision exempts roughly 90% of imports of goods covered by the tax, which it says are only responsible for about 1% of imported emissions. But I thought I would hand it over to you, Shana. Can you please give us a brief overview of the must-know changes to CBAM?
Yeah, of course. As announced through the Clean Industrial Deal at the beginning of this year, we finally have a simplification of the CBAM regulation, which was highly criticized by stakeholders and also member states' administrations for being overcomplicated and essentially too much. We have two big changes which come with this simplification. One impacts the smaller importers of CBAM goods and the other one targets the larger ones. So starting off with the first big change, the Commission is proposing, because I should mention that this is a proposal, so it does have to go through a legislative process. The Commission is proposing a new de minimis threshold, because the current one is not useful because it's too low. So the proposal is that CBAM declarants who import less than 50 tons a year of iron and steel, aluminum, fertilizers, and cement CBAM goods are going to be excluded from the CBAM obligations. So they are going to be categorized as occasional CBAM importers, actually, and they will not have to purchase these CBAM certificates nor do any of the obligations. So why has this been done? The thing is that the monitoring and reporting obligations have been ongoing for some time already, and the Commission has identified that around 80% of CBAM importers only accounted for 0.1% of the emissions, meaning that their environmental impact was very little, but their efforts with the administration and the bureaucracy were huge. So actually, with this new threshold, 91% of the original CBAM importers are excluded. That is a lot. And from these 91%, actually 74% are SMEs. So the burden on this has been heavily reduced. But the environmental integrity of the regulation remains untouched. But however, I want to mention lastly that this 50 tons threshold is going to be revised in 2027 and every 2 years thereafter to see if it continues to reflect the reality of the market.
Shana, I noticed that you used the word simplification, and this is something that the Commission insists, that this is simplification and not deregulation. Is that a fair distinction by the Commission?
I think so. I would say it is a simplification. We are not deregulating because we're not really abandoning the targets. Still, 99% of the emissions are under the CBAM scope. So the environmental objectives are kept in that sense, but we're reducing the burden on the smaller actors here that they don't really have a big environmental impact in that sense. So I would say it's a simplification indeed.
And another part that you sort of alluded to in your opening statement is that the bill still needs approval from the Parliament and the Council. Is it likely to survive in its current form, or can it be revised further?
My logic says it should be a quick process and it should be kept as it is now with the proposal, because this proposal has been prepared with stakeholders and with NGOs, both of them. It has been presented by the EPP, so that support is there. It benefits small companies, which means you should have the support from the S&D, and it still keeps the environmental targets, so you should have the yes from the Greens too. But we know that anything can happen in the EU, so we're going to have to wait and see. But my logic says that it should be kept as it is.
What about you, Sid? Do you have anything to add there? Will the bill change in any way or shape, or is this how CBAM will look going forward?
Of course, it's a great question, Carl, and a very important one. Of course, things do change in terms of the political sphere. There's still quite a way to go. The EU is balancing multiple different interests, including the need to maintain the competitiveness of EU industry in a world where trade barriers are growing, and measures by the EU can affect the trade policy of other countries and regions, notably now the US, which responds to trade barriers quite strongly, to say the least. Real or perceived trade barriers, in fact. So things can change in the policy making process based on what's happening in the outside world. Though I do see that the intention of EU policymakers in order to maintain the standards of low emission manufacturing and economy do remain there. So that will color the process going forward, I would say.
Yeah, I mean, going into this mandate period, we talked a lot about the fact that the parliamentary structure has shifted quite a bit, and it has so to the right, and that could have lessened the climate ambition of this commission in comparison to the previous one. And in that vein, I mean, what does this package reveal about the political momentum around the Green Deal in Brussels? Does this new introduced flexibility introduce uncertainty for manufacturers and investors going forward, or is this sort of Brussels meeting their demands?
Well, in terms of the position of manufacturers and investors and uncertainty, certainly it's quite in many cases difficult to make a long-term investment decision when the policy framework that companies are operating under is uncertain. On that note, companies do have to decide whether to increase their manufacturing capacity within the EU or continue to import materials into the EU, even if there is a border tax on it, along with reporting requirements and obligations, which in some cases can be onerous. In terms of dealing with uncertainty, one point which must be noted is that the policy ambition as of now is more or less an upper limit on what the EU will mandate. And it is quite ambitious and can be quite burdensome, but there's risk more to the downside, that the policy becomes less onerous. And that goes for both the CBAM, which is for imports, and the EU ETS, which is for companies operating within the EU. So on that note, companies can start moving forward and taking investment decisions, knowing that most likely the burdens on them will not increase in either of these two positions. But the calculation between whether to increase capacity in the EU or outside is very much an optimization as to which one really costs more.
Yeah, I saw Shauna waving her hand. Do you have something to add to this?
Yeah, I feel like I'm going to sound very pro-European here, but I just wanted to say that I don't feel there is political uncertainty with these changes because, as I've said before, when the original CBAM regulation was released, there was a lot of criticism behind that proposal. Stakeholders were complaining, also member states administrations were complaining about it being too difficult. So the changes that we're seeing now have actually been demanded by the European society. So, and this proposal has been created according to those demands. So again, feeling very pro-European saying this, but I don't feel there is this political or regulatory uncertainty in this sense.
Well, I think it's worth noting that, nowhere is the pressure more visible than in the EU steel industry, with Chinese steel exported to the EU and EU production in the meantime falling to very low levels. So the gap between sort of overcapacity abroad and declining competitiveness at home is sort of widening here. And absolutely, CBAM may offer protection on paper, but the cost pass-through could exacerbate and further sort of erode industrial demand and also support for these policy mechanism. And that sort of takes me to another question here, that can CBAM realistically strengthen European competitiveness where EU production is more expensive than in many third countries? And what does that do to both EU competitiveness and the cohesion of the Union?
Right, and that's a very good point, Carl. The introduction of measures like the CBAM and the EU ETS, for that matter, do raise costs for manufacturing in Europe. Now, whether the competitiveness of Europe is maintained under these conditions depends to a great extent on the demand side in Europe itself. We see plans such as in Germany to increase spending in order to bolster defense, and that leads to higher demand. And demand is really what defines the ability of European industry to maintain offtake, essentially. Now, costs being higher in Europe is one part of it. The intention of the CBAM is not to maintain competitiveness. That's not really the intention, but it is to a great extent to pass the costs of emissions throughout the world, to spread them out and ensure that other countries start to impose their own carbon taxation. If that happens, then manufacturing across the world starts to be on more of a level playing field. But in the absence of that, it does make European manufacturing more expensive. And so that needs to be propped up by European demand. And in terms of cohesion, of course, we see a lot happening in terms of the larger and more economically well-off European countries supporting their local industry with lots of state aid. Now, that has been controversial in the past and will continue to be so, where companies in, say, Germany and France are probably in a better position to be supported for their decarbonisation measures. That's not a change based on history, but increasing the competitive advantage of different countries in the EU so that they can benefit from each other through trade at lower costs does strengthen the competitiveness of the bloc. And that's something to remember to keep an eye on, especially as protectionism grows in political visibility.
I think that's a very good point, Sid, but I see time is running out, and that sort of takes us to our final question. Before the turn of the year, we talked a lot about the state of European economy and the state of many large manufacturers, most notably in Germany. How will the revised CBAM, Shana, affect the larger producers?
Yeah, well, the larger companies, which are more or less 10% of the CBAM importers, they still have to be compliant with the rest of the CBAM obligations. However, as I said many times, they were complaining a lot about how complicated the regulation was and how many of the requirements and bureaucratic steps were just completely unnecessary. So they are not exempted from the obligations, but these have been very simplified, I would say. And when one goes through these new rules and reads the new changes, they're actually very logic, because the steps or the requirements that the Commission is proposing to remove are actually completely unnecessary, in my opinion. For example, one of the obligations now removed or proposed to be removed was that if you were using for certain emissions the default values that the Commission publishes, you still had to verify those numbers. And that really makes no sense, because they are given by the Commission itself. So it's completely redundant. And we have several changes like this one. But also recently, the annual deadlines for the EU ETS reporting were delayed in the year. And now the deadlines for the CBAM match the ones in the EU ETS. So it makes everything easier and smoother. So I think these changes, again, the simplification and not the deregulation of the CBAM are very helpful for larger companies, and many unnecessary steps are going to be removed, hopefully.
Very much needed, cutting through the European red tape. But as always, we finish off by pointing to something that we at ELS Analysis will keep our eye on in the coming week. So starting off with you, Sid, what are you looking out for?
Of course, Carl. So essentially, I'm keeping my eyes on the same thing that we have, and much of the world, I think, has been watching for the past month or so, which is really how plans for international trade are changing given the tariff regimes. Investment decisions are being pushed back, reshuffled. Changes in tax laws are causing investors to rethink their geographic positioning of, for example, data centers up here in the Nordics. I'll be watching very much on those things, how tax and trade policy affects investor sentiment in the Nordics, but also more globally.
What about you, Shana?
Yeah, I wanted to briefly mention that the EU Steel and Metal Action Plan is also out. We have not explored this today because otherwise this pod would become too much, but we will certainly do that in another episode and also on our platform. But regarding the CBAM, of course, I guess I will be following the legislative process and the political support this proposal receives both at the Parliament and at the Council, and also how fast things go.
Right, I'm just going to finish off by mentioning that the Social Democrats has come out saying that they will reject the government's upcoming nuclear risk sharing proposal in Parliament. And one of the big demands from industry has been to sort of cement a broad agreement around this proposal. So I will definitely be following how the government responds to that going forward. I think that's all from us today. We're hitting that 20-minute mark. So until next week, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you for tuning in to Energy Bites with ELS Analysis. To know more about our advisory offerings, email us at els@elsanalysis.com or visit our website www.elsanalysis.com. Follow us on LinkedIn to stay up to date on our latest activity. We wish you a good and productive week ahead.